Whenever we're having a discussion about the enemies from within that Donald Trump refers to, he often likes to point the finger at Democrats when really we need to be looking at the people that are in and around his party and his regime. And no discussion of the enemies within can be complete without talking about the billionaire funders that back his campaign and his regime. At the top of that list are Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. And when we think about Elon Musk, we have to understand that this is somebody who was born and bred in apartheid era South Africa. And his family lineage has deep ties and history to the Nazi regime. In fact, when you look at his grandfather and even his father, they had deep affinity for apartheid era South Africa and Nazi policies. So when you look at his obsession with the great replacement theory and all of these eugenics based reasoning, it has its roots in his Nazi and apartheid era upbringing. And while Elon has apparently had some sort of falling out with Trump, which I don't necessarily buy, it's important to consider that the vast majority of billionaire funders that are surrounding the Trump campaign all have a vested interest in advancing the white supremacist core that is at the heart of the Trump regime. And when we're talking about white supremacy and evil billionaires, no discussion of that can be complete without talking about Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is the right wing backer of so many dystopian ideas. And he paints himself as a libertarian, although what he says is libertarian ideals is a complete bastardization of what libertarianism stands for. Think about what Peter Thiel wants. Here's Peter Thiel talking about what the next series of great men are going to look like and how he believes society needs to be restructured.
The basic idea was that we could never win an election on getting certain things because we were in such a small minority. But maybe you could actually unilaterally change the world without having to constantly convince people and beg people and plead with people who are never going to agree with you through a technological means. And this is where I think technology is this incredible alternative to politics.
Any discussion of Peter Thiel and Elon Musk needs to include the damage that they've already done to the US in the short amount of time that they've been involved with this regime. We all know all of the things that happened with Doge. And what's interesting about the activities that Doge has been involved with, they're operating under the cover of government efficiency. What's actually happened is that Doge has embedded all sorts of backdoors and Trojan horses and who knows what else within key systems across all of government. And this works hand in hand with the overarching plan that Peter Thiel has in terms of his vision for a technocratic, elite led future. One of the stated objectives that Thiel has is to leverage technology and leverage the power of Silicon Valley and all of his billionaire tech bro buddies to reform society into something that is more palatable to the interests of the elite. Now, they have gone forward over the last couple of decades under the banner of being supposed libertarians, when the reality of it is that these people are using libertarianism as a cover for being some of the worst dictators and oligarchs in the history of man. What they are proposing is not new. It is the consolidation of power and wealth in the hands of the very few, and everyone else is cannon fodder. And when you think about what Peter Thiel really wants, there's a reason why a number of his companies are deeply involved in various government contracts and efforts, because this is all part of a bigger plan to own all of the data of every single individual in the US and around the globe. And once this data is compiled and organized, it creates a global web of surveillance that the billionaire tech oligarchs can control and dictate the lives of every citizen that is on the planet. When you look at the influence of Peter Thiel and Elon Musk within this regime, you see it take shape in terms of the executive orders that have been issued. And one particular executive order was recently signed by Trump, which mandated that all government agencies should be doing whatever they can with the aid of Palantir to remove data silos across the entire face of government. And what this does is that it centralizes all of that data into Palantir's databases. And once there, anybody and everybody can do whatever they want with it to advance the interests of the surveillance state that they're going for. So when you think about the inner circle of evil that is around this administration, and particularly the billionaires that are involved, and particularly the PayPal mafia, the things that they've already done are going to take decades to unwind. And that is why, when this is resolved, there is no other alternative than to make sure the Elon Musk, the Peter Thiels, the Mark Andreessens, and everybody else, the entire billionaire class that have contributed to this Nazi regime, receive a reckoning that is directly proportional to the damage that they've caused. If these people are not in front of a Nuremberg style trial, it is going to be a massive problem. Peter Thiel, the PayPal mafia, and all of the billionaires that are surrounding the Trump administration, they all have their ideological base being formed by a guy named Curtis Yarvin. And Curtis Yarvin is a blogger and Silicon Valley influencer who has been, for the better part of the last 10 years, talking about the dark enlightenment. And his argument is that democracy is a failed idea. And there needs to be a consolidation of forces amongst the elite, where the elite rule in very much the same way that a CEO runs the company. And basically, these quote unquote great men exert the level of influence necessary to run the country and run the world in a way that feeds the economic engine for the elites. That is Curtis Yarvin's philosophy. And all of these Silicon Valley billionaires and millionaires have latched onto it and are obviously using Donald Trump as their vessel to achieve those ends. When you look at some of the investments that these billionaires have wrapped themselves up in, they are actively working at creating these quote unquote freedom cities and freedom zones all around the world. Some of them are being launched in the US, but you have places like El Salvador and Guatemala, which have enclaves of these societies being propped up by these billionaires in an effort to topple those governments and create states where there are no rules other than what these billionaires want to set. And Peter Thiel has his fingers in all of them. And when you think about the shady connections of Peter Thiel, it is interesting to note that Peter Thiel has invested in some of the ventures that Jeffrey Epstein was involved in, and the Epstein estate is reaping the benefits even today after those Peter Thiel investments. So when you think about Peter Thiel as the godfather of the Republican regime, he and his other billionaire friends all have similar rootings in apartheid era South Africa and Nazi ideology. In fact, when you look at the hangers on in the Trump administration, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk are obviously get the ones that get all the headlines. These two have deep roots in South African apartheid era ideology. In fact, Peter Thiel grew up in a town that celebrated Hitler's birthday well into the post World War II era, into the 70s. And that gives you an idea of this person's wiring. And when you think about his conversations about how he views minorities and DEI and the global South and the global majority, you start getting to understand the picture that he has in his mind about what the ideal society looks like. It's largely white. It's almost completely made up of elites, and everybody else are just cogs in the machine designed to feed their wealth. But Peter Thiel is not alone when you look at the billionaire enemies within that are operating in plain sight. David Sachs is another PayPal who is deeply tied to the Trump administration, and shocker, another South African influenced billionaire who is working on creating his utopian society of elites. Rolf Botha, who is the son of the last apartheid era South African prime minister, Peak Botha, is also deeply involved in the PayPal mafia and associated with the Trump regime. And these are all people with deep roots in the apartheid era South African roots that these billionaires have. But it's not just these people, these billionaires that are subverting democracy. You have other billionaires that are in and around the Trump administration that also have similar ideologies. In fact, when you look at the Trump cabinet, this is the wealthiest cabinet in the history of the US, made up of multimillionaires and billionaires that are setting policy that stomps out the middle class and lower class in order to fund their pet projects and their corruption. When we are talking about the enemies from within, all of these conversations are important, but we need to understand that within the context of the US, there are roughly 10,000 people who have net worths over $100 million. So these are the elite of the elite. And this group of 10,000, if we're talking about who is really the enemy from within, it is people in and around this cohort of the American population. These roughly 10,000 people with net worths more than what any of us will ever see in our lifetime. These are the people who are setting policy and driving society. And the reason why these people are allowed to flourish dates all the way back to policies that have been put in by the Reagan administration. And when you look at all of the economic policies and tax policies that have been put into place from Reagan going forward, now we start to understand why the wealth gap continues to widen, why whenever there is an economic crisis, it is the middle class and the lower class that finances the ability of the elite, the top 1%, to continue to be rescued and bailed out while we are left picking up the pieces. Think about every crisis that has happened since the Reagan administration. In every crisis, the net worths of the millionaires and billionaires continue to go up and climb, while the rest of us, the 99%, are left wrecked in the aftermath. And this, the failure to connect the dots between tax policy, economic policy, and bailouts and the impact on the widening wealth gap is one of the big reasons that the Trump regime has risen to power. When we're talking about what needs to be done after this is settled, one of the things that absolutely needs to be done is a reevaluation of the power of the elites within society. I've said over and over again that every billionaire is evil. And what needs to happen in the post Trump era is that we need to bring back the 90% tax rate. And that tax needs to be applied both to income and wealth. In a functioning society, billionaires should not exist. There's a reason why I say that all billionaires are evil, because their wealth, a fraction of their wealth, could solve so many problems, but they deliberately decide not to use that wealth to solve those problems on a daily basis. When we're talking about a fundamental reordering of society, billionaires should cease to exist. They should be taxed out of existence, and their wealth should be redistributed across the globe to solve some of the most pressing problems that exist today. When we look at the conflicts that are happening all across the globe, it's billionaire interests that are driving those conflicts. Whenever we hear the word terrorist, the reason the word terrorist is used is because people of that country refuse to bend the knee to some billionaire interests. So the billionaires mobilize the military industrial complex and label those countries terrorists. You see this happening in Africa currently, where there's a realignment going on in Africa, where many African countries are moving away from the West and are also consolidating their power with the interest of having their economies be developed through their natural resources. The current power structure in terms of how the world is organized has the global south being the source of raw materials for the West. And when you see Asian countries and African countries state that they no longer are going to play by these games, you see language popping up where these countries are labeled terrorist havens. All of that language comes out of billionaires' interests in extracting as much wealth as they can from the global south and from society in general to feed their own interests. That is why they're setting up these freedom towns and freedom principalities all across the globe. It is an extraction exercise, which again supports the narrative that these people are unflinchingly evil and need to be eliminated from society. How do we do that? There needs to be a 90% tax that is levied on the income of billionaires. There needs to be a 90% wealth tax implemented to these billionaires. And what is interesting is that all of these billionaires have convinced everyone else that if we give them more tax cuts, we'll be better off. We've seen that hasn't worked over the last 50 years. So obviously, the solution is to do something different. And that is what needs to be done. When we understand that the roughly 10,000 people in the US who have net worths over 100 million are truly the core of the enemies within and the evil that exists within the world, even within that group, there are people and companies that deserve some attention. And chief among them are two specific companies that I think deserve some extreme scrutiny. What we've seen over the last several months since this regime has taken over has been the mass mobilization of masked traffickers hitting the streets and kidnapping people in broad daylight. That initiative has been driven by Stephen Miller's policy, but there are two companies and their CEOs that we need to pay attention to that are the tips of the spear when it comes to putting into place the mechanism for ethnic cleansing that is happening right now. Those two companies are Core Civic and Geo Group. Core Civic and Geo Group are two security companies that have massive contracts with the Trump regime to run private prisons. These are two companies that are in the business of imprisoning people in the US. In the land of the free, these people and these companies are profiting off of the misery that this regime is putting forward, and they're profiting from creating some of the worst gulags in American history. And when we look at the companies and their mission and the people that are running both of those companies, we need to understand the roles that Damon Hinninger and J. David Donahue played. These two are the CEOs of these two companies. And when we put it into a historical context, these two companies and their CEOs are no different than the people that were running the gas chambers and concentration camps in Nazi era Germany. These two people and these two companies are in the business of extermination for profit. So when we're talking about the enemies from within and the evil that exists within the world, the Trump regime has surrounded itself with the worst of the worst when it comes to evil billionaires and evil multimillionaires who are banking on their ability to continue to persecute, imprison, traffic, and exterminate brown and black faces all across the country and all around the world. And let's not forget, when we talk about the two CEOs that run these companies, when we move away from the billionaires that need to be put on trial in a Nuremberg style fashion, the next in line should be the CEOs of these two companies, because they are literally being paid and getting bonused on how many people they can traffic off of the streets of the US and put into gulags never to be seen from again. These are people that need watching. When we take inventory of all of these things that we've seen and we take inventory of what this regime is about, they are so easy and quick to point the finger at everybody else being the true evil that exists within this world because they know the operation that they are running. As always, when it comes to this regime and the Republican Party, it's always about projection. Whenever they accuse somebody of something else, it is stuff that they're doing. We've seen this over and over again in the data. They point the finger at immigrants being violent and dangerous criminals, all the while, who is the most criminal demographic in the US? It is white Christian males who are the most dangerous demographic in the US. When this administration points the finger at the trans community or the LGBTQIA plus community as being groomers and child predators, who is the actual group that is most likely to be predators of children? White Christian males. When this regime talks about the evil and the enemy within, they point the finger at anybody that isn't MAGA. But who are the people that are running out in the streets and bombing governors' mansions and assassinating Democrats and having target lists for abortion facilities and running their vehicles into traffic. Who are they? White Christian males, Republicans, Trump voters. What that indicates is a pattern. This is a pattern of behavior within this group. If we're really going to be serious about the enemies within, and we're really going to be serious about reorienting society in a way where we can have progress, there needs to be a massive effort at demagnification of the US. The MAGA of today are no different than the Nazi supporters in Germany in the 30s, 40s, in the post World War II era. There needs to be a lot of education and a lot of work that needs to be done to rehabilitate those that can be rehabilitated. But between now and then, one thing is certainly clear. The calls that keep going out for middle ground and compromise are a waste of time. There is no compromise with these people. There is no compromise with people who fundamentally believe that unless you're white, Christian, and male, you do not have a right to exist. These are not people that can be reasoned with. These are not people that can be debated with. They need to be shunned, ridiculed, and ignored, and they need to be completely stripped away from the levers of power so that they can no longer do damage. That is what needs to be done. And the sooner we can do it, the better off we'll be. And while the No Kings protests and the ongoing protests against this regime are a good start, no meaningful change will happen unless we ramp up the intensity of not only these protests, but also the economic boycotts that need to happen to hit the bottom lines of the funders of this regime. There's a reason why Trump backed down on his immigration stance. It's because his donor class said, hey, rounding up immigrants like what you're doing is hurting our bottom lines. It's causing our businesses to fail. That is a signal of the damage that's being done from his policies. So we as consumers and citizens need to boycott these companies and cut off their revenue. Every one of these companies that are supporting this regime needs to feel it in their pocketbooks. Walmart is starting to see it. Target is starting to see it. You're seeing all of these companies start to see it. And that is where we need to go to next. We need to continue what we're doing from a protest perspective, but we need to escalate the boycott and withhold financial support to any and every company that backs this regime. And let's be clear, if you're in the group of companies that is saying nothing, you're on that list too. Those organizations that receive our support in terms of economic support and commerce need to be the ones that are vocally standing against this regime. You can't be a bystander. None of us are bystanders in this. And until we recognize that we hold the power and we cut off the purse strings of these organizations, nothing's going to change. So these protests are a good start. But if we really want to eliminate the evil that exists within this country, MAGA and their business interests need to be crushed.